The House of Mystery presents Inside Writing, the radio show where authors discuss their writing process in all genres.
Excellent book. We have it on our website now, guys, so you can go to it one click, pick it up. It's called A Spy Named Orphan, and it's the enigma of Donald Maclean. Really, really good book, and it's very interesting for this time period as well, with all the spy talking and Russia and all that stuff. So now Ronald Phillips is joining us. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome. It's a pleasure. Great book. And now, first of all, before we get into some details, you yourself, how did you get into writing this book?
I got into it. I came into it two ways, in fact. First of all, it's a tale of my grandfather's, in effect, as well. One of my grandfathers was a communist throughout his life, as was my subject, Donald Maclean, and even after the end of communism, still said it was the right course in spite of what was known about its practice under Stalin in particular. My other grandfather was in the Foreign Office, the British State Department, as was Maclean. He was, in fact, Maclean's boss. He gave him his final job, and he was the last diplomat to see him before Donald Maclean defected in 1951, and was indeed widely blamed for allowing him to defect. But in fact, that grandfather, his name was Roger Makins, although he had been told that Donald Maclean was the spy they had been looking for some years. He'd been told that Maclean was being watched by the security services, which indeed he was. Anyone could see the watchers following him. But he was never told that the watchers didn't work in the evenings and at weekends. So when he gave Donald Maclean the day off, he assumed that he'd be watched throughout that time, but in fact Donald Maclean was allowed to flee the country. So I come at it through the family roots, and also because I was tipped off that a huge amount of previously classified material was about to emerge in the archives, and that told a wonderful story, both of establishment bungling and the whole story back through Maclean's life of his growth into communism and his later spying. So I had a wealth of material as well as a personal connection.
So now he was born in Britain, and how did he get into having such extreme views on the left side, like being a commie or Marxist?
Well, his father was a great liberal. He was a liberal politician and a cabinet minister at the end of his life. He was also a devout churchman, Presbyterian, instilled in all his children that one should follow one's conscience, whatever the conscience was telling you. He didn't mean it to mean communism. I think he meant something more spiritual. So that was a part of it. And then Maclean went to a school that reinforced this message that you have to think freely and work for your fellow man. And the final key was the time in which he grew up. He was at University of Cambridge in the Depression. He saw the workers, the poverty-stricken workers, they were called the hunger marchers, marching on London to make their case. They had no work and no food. He saw the rise of fascism in Europe, Hitler and Mussolini, and the terrible things that came about there. They were very much aware of the damage the First World War had wrought on the generation above them, and he decided that communism was the only way to world peace, and that was what he held dear to until the end of his life in 1983.
Wow. Now, so when we get his life, when he's in the university, did he have any relationships? Was he seeing a lady at the time, or was this all before?
This was all before. So at university, that's when he burst into communism really after his father died in his first year at university, and he made friends there with, amongst others, Kim Philby, who was also a later spy, and went on marches and was a staunch member of the University Socialist Society, and that's where he got really indoctrinated, sitting up late at night in smoke-filled rooms in Cambridge, talking about all this. And his plan was that he should, after he left Cambridge in 1934, he was planning to go to live in Russia to teach English to the workers, so that when world communism came about, he would be in, the workers would speak English. But a chance, Philby asked him to dinner just after he left. Philby was a year older than him, had already been recruited into communism, into to being a spy by a brilliant recruiter I'll talk about in a moment. And the first thing this recruiter said to Philby was, which of your fellow graduates would be a good spy, and top of his list was Maclean. So he had Maclean supper in London and said, it's all very well, this plan of Maclean's to go and live in the Soviet Union, but he could do far more good if he was to work underground, if you know what I mean, as he said. Maclean leapt at this and said, you mean work for the party? And Philby said, yes. And if you were to go into the Foreign Office and work your way up, rather than to simply go and live the communist dream, but actually to take it underground. So he was recruited as soon as he left and leapt at the chance.
Well, wasn't he worried? Wow. Wasn't he worried about, like, okay, so you're living in England, and it's not a communist country, so to be part of that's one thing, but to actually want to pursue a career with it, wasn't that hard for his family, like to be around his parents and anybody else?
Well, he was always able, until the Cold War got going after the Second World War, he was always able to separate the two parts for himself completely. And of course, Russia was not the enemy that she later became, but indeed an ally. And Maclean seemed able to live the two lives. He was a remarkable diplomat. He was very quickly promoted up the diplomatic ladder, at the same time as he was the single most prolific and important spy the Russians had in the country. So he seemed completely able to live the two lives. He later said how much he loathed spying. He said it was like being a laboratory attendant, terrible business, but someone has to do it. But at the time, he went about it with absolute meticulousness. And it was a really extraordinary ability he had to live the two lives. His family had no idea. And he, until he met his wife, which we'll come on to in a minute or two, but he was able to do both things at once.
Now, you are making this sound so easy. I mean, when you say recruited, what were the methods that they recruited him? Who approached him and how? You don't just walk up to somebody and say, hey, I think you're the perfect candidate. You want to be a spy?
Absolutely. The recruiter was a brilliant man called Oscar Deutsch, who was a Viennese Jew who'd studied chemistry. He was brilliant. He'd got his PhD at the age of only 24. And he'd been a chemist, in fact, but has a sideline psychology. And after he left the University of Vienna, he worked with a pupil of Freud's in the psychological department. And when he came to London, he was already signed up to the forerunner of the KGB, the NKVD. And he came to London, and he was the first recruiter to realize that if you could find the young ideologues out of the good universities who were going to go into the professions that ran Britain, you could recruit them young. Any communist sympathies that they had at university could be put down to youthful idealism, and then they would work their way up. He also had 3 criteria for the perfect spy that he'd worked out, which were a predilection for secrecy, which is obviously a vital one, a class resentfulness, which helps, of course, if you're going to be a communist spy, and the one he spotted that interests me most is what he called an infantile need for praise and reassurance. And each of the 5 Cambridge spies all had either issues with their fathers or dead fathers, as in Maclean's case. And that need for praise and reassurance, which he got from the Communist Party, from the KGB, sustained Maclean throughout his life. And in his later spying career, when the reassurance was withdrawn through a chapter of accidents more than anything, that's when he began to crack up, and he exposed himself. And so Oscar Deutsch, Arnold Deutsch, his cousin was Oscar, who brought about the Odeon cinema chain, which stands for Oscar Deutsch Entertains Our Nation. Arnold Deutsch was able to spot the psychological requirements for a spy, and through Philby, as soon as he met Maclean, he thought this man fits the bill perfectly.
Oh, wow. So would it be fair to say then that he was psychologically profiled, that they had been watching him for a while, and he met A, B, C, and D traits that they were looking for?
Absolutely right. And he completely, that's a good way of putting it. He was psychologically profiled. And after he'd been recruited by Deutsch said, work your way, you'll be a sleeper, you'll work your way up the Foreign Office and you'll come into your own later on. But from the moment Maclean went in there, the psychological profile was so perfect that he was already producing thousands of documents in his first months in the Foreign Office. Indeed, so many that they had to have his own handler to photograph the documents and take care of him. He couldn't be with the handler handling other spies in London, so they sent a woman called Kitty Harris, who was 14 years older than Maclean, came to London to look after him, and astonishingly, they began an affair. So there's their top spy and their top spy's handler sleeping together, which caused consternation in Moscow Center. But they decided, in the normal course of events, certainly Kitty would have been brought back and probably executed, and Maclean would have been dropped, because who knows what secrets were leaking. But so important was Maclean to them, he was codenamed Orphan, as in the title of my book at that point. So important was he to them that they not only allowed them to continue the affair and to the sending of huge amounts of material, but when Maclean was posted to Paris in 1938, Kitty went with him.
Wow.
To that vital post, just as the run-up to the Second World War began.
So, Roland, you said an exciting word in there, and that's sleeper.
Yes.
That just reeks of Jason Bourne. So,
yes, so, absolutely.
Did they provide him an identity, and here's the job you're going to be working, and here's how you're going to live? Kind of like some of the TV dramas that we have, the Russian spies who live in America for 20 years and they're your average citizens.
That series, The Americans, I very much enjoyed. Well, he was absolutely, because he was living the life anyway, because he was a very good and successful diplomat, they didn't need to provide any cover or backup materials, all the cars they have in those dramas or anything, because he simply in the day went about his work, and in the evenings would take home briefcases full of documents. There was no security in the Foreign Office at all. There wasn't even a security officer until the Second World War. And so he didn't need a cover story, because his cover story, he was living perfectly.
So when it gets to that, what I was going to get into that. How could they not realize that he was, passing on so many documents and doing so much? Like, is it because they didn't want to believe he was a spy, or what was the story?
It was quite simply an atmosphere of trust that the British establishment worked in. I think it worked in that atmosphere of trust until, in fact, Maclean defected. That was the first rupturing of that. They believed that anyone who'd been to the right school and the right university, and he had the right father, remember his father being a cabinet minister and was a knight, that they could not be trustworthy. Indeed, Maclean was asked at his interview for the Foreign Office, they said, "We note you were very left-wing at university, are you still?" To which he answered, "I'm working on it," quite truthfully. And they said, "That's fine, in you come." And they simply trusted Maclean and his ilk throughout, which once they were looking for the spy in the late 1940s and early 1950s, when they had evidence that there had been a spy in the British Embassy in Washington, uncovered by a remarkable National Security Agency decoding operation, they quite simply refused to look at anyone senior, including Maclean, for some 3 years. Their first reaction on being told there'd been a spy was, "It won't be a senior man, we must look at anyone junior who had a nervous breakdown." They simply believed their people were honest.
Well, lesson learned.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Now, did he marry Kitty, or what happened there?
No, he didn't marry Kitty. When he was in Paris in 1938, in fact, in late 1939, after the war had started, he was still spying there, and Kitty was still his handler and lover. But one day on the left bank in Paris, he didn't really like the whole stuffy, diplomatic, entertaining atmosphere, much preferred to prowl around amongst the bohemians and intellectuals on the left bank. And one day he went into a cafe on the left bank and saw a frail, waif-like woman called Melinda Marling, and fell instantly in love with her. Melinda was American.
Uh-oh.
She came from quite a broken home. There was quite a lot of money there, though. She'd gone to Paris to be at the Sorbonne University with her sister. And I believe, and the first clue to Melinda's character came when I learned that the American embassy in Paris had said to all the American citizens, as war had come closer, and by the time Donald Maclean met Melinda, the war had been underway for 2 months. The American embassy had told all its citizens to go home. Melinda's sister had gone home, leaving her behind, and I get from that Melinda loved the thrill of danger. She disobeyed that rule. So she was in France, which was shortly going to be invaded. And when she met Donald, she first of all didn't want to have anything to do with him because he looked like a stuffed shirt British diplomat. So he took the second gigantic risk of his espionage career and told her he was a spy, at which point she fell in love with him because, as I say, I think she loved the thrill that gave her of secrecy. So, but Kitty continued to have to move out of his flat, but continued to handle his espionage until he had to leave France in a hurry after the German invasion in June 1940. And even that is another example of how Melinda pushed things, because she refused to marry him until just before 5 days before the Nazis arrived in Paris, at which point they hurriedly got married and evacuated France. And it's the only black mark on Maclean's file in the Foreign Office is he wasn't on hand to evacuate the embassy because he was off getting married.
Oh. Now, did she get involved in his spying, so to speak, or did she just approve of it and let him do it?
She She didn't get involved until right at the end of his spying career in 1951. So Maclean's great espionage time was when he was in the British Embassy in Washington between 1944 and 48, and he gave away from there the shape of post-war Europe, all the negotiations up to the Yalta Conference. He gave away the formation of NATO. He gave away, most importantly, he was on the Atomic Energy Commission.
Oh, wow. Now that puts him...
And, yes. He had an access all areas past the Atomic Energy Commission, which even his boss, my grandfather, didn't have. And so he was able to say exactly to the Soviets exactly how many bombs the Americans were capable of building, which was nothing like their public pronouncements. And I believe gave the Soviets the confidence to build their bomb 2 years earlier than expected. So these were his great days of espionage. At the same time, as the Cold War developed, he was getting more and more anti-capitalist. He was drinking very heavily. He was given to outbursts about his wife's countrymen at grand Washington dinner parties with Catherine Graham and the owner of the Washington Post and others. He would insult the Secretary of State. None of this got onto his file. They all said poor old Donald's had a bit too much to drink. This behaviour got worse in his next posting in Cairo, when between 1948 and 1950, when he was less praised and reassured by the KGB. And at that point, and when I first started reading about him, I couldn't understand why Melinda didn't leave him at this point, because there are several stories. There's a terrible picnic on the Nile at which he tries to throttle her and has to be dragged off by some of his countrymen. That picnic ended with him brawling on the banks of the Nile and breaking a fellow diplomat's leg in 3 places.
Good Lord. He's off the rails.
Yeah, he's completely off the rails by this point. I think the combination of the Cold War getting really ugly, he's now a divided figure instead of a unified one. And in the following year, 1950, he and a journalist friend of his go on an almighty bender, which ends up with them trashing the American ambassador's secretary's flat in Cairo. I mean, really trashing it, breaking her bath in 2 by hurling a mirror into it, throwing all her clothes out the window. Again, none of this gets onto his file, because they simply don't want to hear tittle-tattle, as they put it, about so able an officer. In spite of all this, he's able to go to work and be brilliant all day. And I didn't understand why Melinda didn't leave him through all this, but instead supported him until he defected in May 1951. And when I saw the Secret Service files on the defection, as I said at the beginning, they were following him, they were tapping his telephone, and I found lies from her on the telephone after he'd defected, which make it absolutely plain she knew what he was up to. And indeed, 2 years after he defected, she'd suddenly disappeared, which caused a complete shock and outrage anew. So I believe that she did know that he was a spy. She may not have known the detail, and she rather enjoyed that and was protecting him and looking out for him. And that's why she stuck to him through this outrageous behavior.
Well, did she never think that if he gets captured or if he gets caught, this is all going to come back to me too? I'm going to go into the gallows with him. Well, or was it worth it to her?
I think she felt that this was the way her life was exciting and the way it was going to be, and she was going to support him and stand by him. I mean, the biggest irony of all is that when she does go, so she defects herself with their 3 young children in 1953. And when Kim Philby, things get too hot for Kim Philby a decade later, and he goes to Moscow, and they're quite friendly, the Philbys and the Macleans. But then Philby, who had to betray everybody he ever knew, betrayed his first recruit, Donald Maclean, and went off with Melinda, and they lived together for 3 years in Moscow. So she didn't leave him until they were safely in Moscow, at which point she went off with his recruiter. I mean, that's a huge irony.
Yes, it is.
So what was it that exactly made him defect to Russia?
Well, there was a decoding opera. Every telegram that left the United States from Moscow during the war, a copy had to be lodged with the Western Union offices. So after the war, there were hundreds of thousands of telegrams, all in code, all in they believed, all in one-time, they'd been put into a one-time code, which means that each telegram would have had a new code set up and therefore be uncrackable. But this genius called Meredith Gardner realized that sometimes they'd used the same pad twice, and through this chink, he began to decode a very, very small proportion of the telegrams. Indeed, when the operation was wound up in 1980, they'd only decoded 15% of the telegrams. But they did keep finding references to a spy called either H or Homer, and they discovered that from the serial numbers that some of this material, and that's how we know that he was giving away such incredibly high-grade material, had come from the British Embassy in Washington. So they spent sort of 3 years trying to, they passed this on to the British, who spent 3 years not trying that hard to identify the spy because they believed it would be a junior person. And indeed, they sent Philby to Washington as head of MI6 station, who obfuscated as well. So it was a decoding operation that kept coming across this material, but they refused to believe the spy was Maclean. They did eventually come around and see it was a senior man, and they made a list of names, 6 or 7 names. Maclean featured on that. But they still, as 1948, 1949, 1950, all this time, Maclean was acting out unseen in this alcoholic way. And then in early 1951, they decoded a tiny fragment that said Homer will be coming to Tyre, which is what they call New York, weekly to see his pregnant wife. And Melinda had been pregnant when they arrived in June 1944, and that made them realize it was Maclean. Even so, the heads of the Foreign Office in London said it can't be him, it must be someone else. But that was the smoking gun that caught him.
Roland,
Maclean got to hear about this from Philby, and then Philby organized his defection.
Roland, this is kind of a sidebar here. We're talking about spies, and the traditional view of spies is everything is so super secret. Nobody knows who they are, and, they're doing all these fabulous things behind the scene, and, the espionage and, the intrigue. But throughout our discussion, I'm sitting here thinking it's almost like everybody knew who everybody else was. And there really wasn't anything secret about it. It was just a matter of things catching up to them. And Donald and Donald starts blowing his cover early just by acting like a jackass.
Absolutely, and that's what's extraordinary is that the trust in him was so absolute, and indeed his work was so extremely good. His legitimate work was so extremely good that even though he's acting like a jackass, they think he's our jackass. He's brilliant. We have no reason to think he's a spy, but hiding in plain sight is the best disguise for a spy. So exactly. So even when after they knew it was a senior man and he was on the list of possible spies, they still made him head of the American department in London, just at the beginning of the Korean War. I mean, they simply could not have been more blind to the possibilities of this spy.
So my work is so good that you have to ignore all this other behavior that could put so much at risk.
Absolutely, and he was tall, he was beautifully dressed, he'd been to the right school, he'd been to the right university, he'd done the work, he never was drunk in the office or appeared hungover. Absolutely, they couldn't believe it, right up until after he went. They still didn't believe it.
So we have a functional alcoholic who does incredible work, and nations are resting on what he does.
Yes. The borders of Poland rested on what he did. He a part of the material we've seen sent was a telegram between Churchill and Truman, President Truman, saying, if Molotov is adamant, we will move the border to here. And guess what? Molotov was adamant. And
wow.
The borders of Poland were set by Maclean's treachery.
Holy smokes. So what, where was the decline? Where did he mess up and start heading south? Pardon the pun.
He started heading south, or maybe east, when the Cold War, up until 1945, communism, as I say, he believed was the only way to world peace. He was able to rightly say to himself Russia was an ally, they should have this material. But as the Cold War got worse, got colder, and I think particularly of what he saw in the atom bomb production line must have made him realize that the creation of atom bombs wasn't necessarily the path to peace. And that's when he began to crack up and came to loathe spying. He kept at it, but he hated it, and I believe that contributed to the alcoholic decline. So it was really as the two halves of him that he kept together so ably during the period began to pull apart. That's when he began to drink heavily, to sound off at dinner parties, and really to hate his life. And he did indeed, in 1948, write to Moscow Center saying, I've had enough of this, take me out now, take me to Moscow, my work is done, I want to live in Moscow. And they ignored that letter, which led to yet more drinking and acting out. So I believe it was when his two halves, because he was, as I say, he was in some senses he was a great patriot. He worked very hard for his country, and it's when those two halves became irreconcilable that it all went wrong.
Now, this question begs to be asked, and I promise I'll shut up for just a moment. This is incredibly important work that he's doing. Like you said, borders, the atomic bomb, everything is now resting on the shoulders of, a drunkard.
Mm-hmm.
Who's acting out in such a public way. At any point, did his handlers or either side, because it almost sounds like he was a double agent, at either side, at any point, did they take him aside and say, listen, you have got to stop the crap. You're going to blow this for everybody.
I think that's why Moscow Center decided he had to be got out. In point of fact, if they stopped after he went to Egypt in 1948, they'd stopped thinking of him as such an important spy. Washington was where they wanted their important spies to be, and indeed that neglect, as he saw it, contributed further to his decline. But they were well aware that if he was arrested and questioned in any way, he'd be blown, which they could live with. I mean, he was blown when he defected anyway. He'd be blown, but their real concern was that he would blow the rest of the spy network, including Kim Philby, who at that point was very senior in in the Secret Service and invaluable to them. And that was why they decided they needed to get him out before that happened. And that's why when Philby said to Moscow Center, the Americans have all but identified Homer, they said, we hold you responsible for getting him out now. And that was and it was Philby's tip-off that led to the defection. So that was their real fear, that he would blow the rest of them sky high. Which, ironically, of course, as soon as he defected and they looked into his background, he did anyway. But they hoped to keep it secure.
Wow. Now, what you were talking about new material? Can you explain that? Like what new materials come out?
Yes. So what I saw was all the files after they knew about Homer in 1947. The files where they tried to identify who Homer might be. Maclean's name kept coming up, but they continually said the high-ups in the Foreign Office said, no, it can't be him. So that was part of the new material. The really exciting new material was the tale on him and the telephone taps in his last month in England, where it becomes apparent you can follow his movements during the day. As I say, they didn't work at weekends in the evenings. You can follow his movements during the day. There's the point, you can see clearly the point when he's told he's going to have to go, and he becomes quite agitated and comes out of the place where he's having lunch and paces up and down, and then goes back in. And the telephone taps where you have Melinda lying to her mother-in-law 2 days after he's gone, saying he's just not here at the moment, but he'll talk to you as soon as he's back. So it was all that material that I thought was really exciting and extraordinary, as you see them failing to snap the trap shut on this terrible spy and traitor. And the other extraordinary thing was the files. That was 10 days after the defection, before it got into the newspaper or to the public at all, when the head of MI6 was in Washington talking to Hoover of the FBI, amongst other people, and he writes a letter back to a friend saying, I was stopped in the corridor, and they asked how we were getting on with finding Homer, and this was 5 days after he'd gone. I said we had 6 or 7 people in the frame, but nothing definite yet. So this notion that we were lying to our closest ally, the United States, even as they had uncovered Homer for us, was extraordinary. So it was the background material to this, in many ways, very sorry tale of missed opportunities.
Wow. So whatever happened to him? So he ended up in Moscow and...
Well, interestingly, yes, he went to Moscow in 1951. Nobody in the West knew what had happened to him until 1956, when he reappeared. He gave a press conference just before Khrushchev came to Britain, and that was deliberately timed so that this wouldn't be the main topic of conversation for Khrushchev when he did come. And he then, once again, well, now he no longer had to live a divided life, he became a whole man again. He got sober. He took on a pseudonym. He called himself Mark Fraser, and Melinda called herself Natasha Fraser. And he worked for a foreign policy institute. He used his great foreign policy brain to good effect. As an academic teaching institute, he wrote many papers under the name Mark Fraser. He wrote a book in 1970, which was when he became Donald Maclean again, and he chose a different name before that so that it wouldn't deflect attention from the very good work he was doing. He was slightly on the dissident wing. He still worked for the underdog of Russian society. And the great sadness of his life, after Melinda came back to him after the affair with Philby, But then in the 1970s, Melinda and all his 3 children and Russian grandchildren all left Moscow. Some went to the United States, some came to England. So he was all alone. But I think in some sense he believed that this was the right thing, that because of his actions his children shouldn't not live the life they would have lived in America or England. But he did die alone without his family in 1983. But his 30 years in Russia were of a man who was whole again, working at what he loved, not having these terrible binges. And it was I think quite a salutary example of how the divisions of his life had torn him apart. But at the end, when he was back together, not having to hide, he was able to function.
Now, one more, Roland. After what you just said, once the pressure was off of him, he was able to reestablish his life and live a relatively normal life. Perhaps I, Kevin, perhaps I was too rough on him. Do you think that his drunkenness and his acting out and his behaviors were due to the immense pressure that was on this one man?
Yes, I do. I think it became unsustainable to him to work for his country, in the service of his country as a diplomat, at the same time as working against his country as a spy. And I think it did become insupportable. But I do think it's remarkable that he pulled himself back together, because the other spies, Kim Philby and Guy Burgess, who defected to America, to Moscow, drank themselves to death, in effect, whereas he went the other way and sobered up. So I think he was a man of high conscience, as his father always wanted him to be, but it was when that conscience was torn apart that things went wrong for him.
Wow. So, and how did it end up with his wife and kids? So they just all moved away, and
they all moved away. Melinda went back in 1979. And the kids went about at the same time. So he had 4 years to live after that. And they all went back. They never spoke. They have never spoken. Melinda died in 2010. The children are all still alive. They've never spoken of their time in Moscow. Indeed, they've never spoken to an author or journalist. Even a friend of mine who's a journalist, who knew the kids when he was a child pretty well, they won't speak to him about their time in Moscow. They when they're in Moscow, the family said, "We will never speak." And Maclean's only interview, Burgess was giving interviews all the time. Maclean's only interview was a few days before he died. He gave an interview to a British newspaper which was a sort of valedictory message, I think, to his kids, saying he hoped he hadn't ruined their lives. But so they did all come back to the West, yes. Having been brought up as perfect Russian children, his letters from Moscow talk about them going to pioneer camp and all that sort of thing. But they all went back to the life they would have had.
So what do you think the legacy is that he's left?
I think the legacy that he's left is, I think the mistrust of the expert and the establishment, I think, stems directly from his defection in 1951. The shock of that someone who was so highly trusted could betray the country, and I think it's not too much of a leap to see that level of mistrust of the political establishment running through to our times in the Brexit referendum, possibly in your last presidential election, that, we don't like experts, and we don't like people steeped in in politics to tell us what to do. And I think he also, I mean, on a more practical level, his legacy here are the vetting procedures that are undergone for civil servants, and that trust in people who've been to the right school and the right university has gone, and I think we take a much more pragmatic look at all our servants nowadays.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Oh, no, go ahead. I was just agreeing. Sorry.
Oh.
Yes. So I think indeed the word establishment used as we've been using it was first coined in a newspaper in Britain to say, what should we call the people who protected him throughout his career? Let us call it the establishment. And I think it's brought about that mistrust is his lasting legacy. His legacy in the second half of the 20th century until the end of communism, I think, speaks for itself, particularly in the shape of Europe.
So what do you hope the readers get from the book?
I hope the readers will get a portrait of a fascinating man of intense contradictions, who has as his backdrop, and indeed he influences that backdrop, the tumultuous middle years of the 20th century. And I think you see a man shaped by his times, who in turn shapes his times, and is a pretty interesting man alongside all that.
Well, great. Now, what's up next for you? More books, or
I do. More books, absolutely, yes. I'm working on another book, this time a subject in the Second World War, again, which brings up questions of patriotism, ideology, how far you push one at the expense of the other, and so on like that. Because I've got really interested in what motivates people to operate around the subject of patriotism, survival, their beliefs, and so on. So I'm working on that now, yes. Yeah,
there's a lot to work on in that area.
Yes.
Yes.
Very interesting.
Yes.
Well, this has been an amazing interview. We've really enjoyed the conversation.
I've enjoyed myself talking to you immensely, yes.
Fascinating.
Again, our book is called Spy Named Orphan, and it's the enigma of Donald Maclean, and the guest has been the author Ronald Phillips. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you for talking to me.
Oh, Roland, thank you.
To find out more about our show, guests, or to listen to past shows from our archive, please go to www.houseofmysteryradio.com.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me?
Well, good night.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.
I'll be back.